All right, so good afternoon, everybody. Welcome on 99 Media. Today I'm back with Professor Roberts, and thank you, Michael, for being with us again. Today we are going to talk about, I will say, as it's probably one of the most important topics within, let's say, classic political economy, which is about the labor theory of value. We prepared a list of questions that hopefully are going to be leading from, let's say, easier to more complicated. So I will just, without further ado, I will get started. So for those less familiar with Marx's labor theory of value, could you briefly explain what it means to say that labor is the source of value under capitalism, and why this remains a foundational concept in Marxian economics? Could you take us through the basic definitions of use value, exchange value, and then possibly prices of production and market prices? I know it's a lot, but I guess that without the very basic definitions, we can't really start.
Sure, Carlo, sure. Well, first, let's remind ourselves, what do you mean by value? It's a word that's presented in economics quite a bit, not just from the left, not just from the Marxist theory of value, or from what used to be called classical political economy, but also for mainstream economics. And in general, the word value is a category used in economics. And what it, I suppose, means is the worth or the value of some to human beings of some particular product or service that they can use. And that's where we're starting from. We're starting from the idea that human beings produce things that they need and that they can use, and that they consume those things if they're useful to them. And what are we talking about? Well, the production of things, but also of services, not just goods that we eat, or clothes that we wear, or houses that we live in, but also services, whether it's in restaurants, whether it's in getting the garbage cleared. There are all sorts of other things which aren't things, but they're services that people need. So we start from the point of view of, has it any use to human beings? There's lots of things that you could produce which don't have any use to human beings. I won't go into them, but we're starting from the first point of view that it's something that we need, something that's worth, and it's useful for human beings. So there's a use value to it. So that's where we start from. However, as we progress in different organizations of human society, we get to the point of view under capitalism where things that we need, use values to us, only become available if they can be sold on the market by the capitalists who control and own those products. There has to be what the economists would call an exchange value. In other words, it's got a value on the market in addition to its worthwhile usefulness for the human being. Obviously, nobody can sell anything on the market if it's not useful to somebody or an organization. But on the other hand, under capitalism, it won't be produced, whether it's a service or a thing, unless it can be sold on the market, and ideally sold on the market for a profit. Because if it doesn't make a profit compared to the cost that the capitalist has gone in to produce that thing or that good or that service, then it won't be produced the next time in the process of production. So Marx starts from a theory of value saying that value is produced when labor is exerted upon production of things like we use and eat or clothe ourselves, and in services. So the basic theory of the labor theory of value is that value is determined by the expenditure of labor power, workers going to work, people going to work to produce things that can then be, in the case of capitalism, can then be sold on the market by the capitalists for a price, and hopefully with a profit out of that. So that's the basis of the labor theory of value. And there's an alternative theory of value, which we could discuss, but that's the labor theory of value. But Marx went a bit further than the classical economists like Smith, Ricardo, and others, who said, yes, value is really determined by the amount of labor it's put into it. You can measure it in hours. But Marx went further than that, said, well, actually, that might be the value of the product, but it isn't what the value of the work, what the workers get from going to work. When workers go to work, he said, a simple example, say they work for 8 hours, they get paid wages, they get wages for their day's work of 8 hours, but the actual value involved in the in their area of work that they put in, that they get in wages, which they can then use to buy all the goods and things that they need, is probably only about 4 of those 8 hours. And over the whole 8 hours, they get 4 hours worth of labor value back, but the other 4 hours is appropriated by the owners of the means of production, capitalists, because the difference between capitalists and workers is that they own the means of production. They own the factories, they own the equipment, and they only they employ workers. Workers don't have any of those ownerships and property that they can do to produce their own things. Not anymore. 90% of people work for a capitalist. They don't work for themselves anymore, even globally now. So what you get is the possibility of the capitalist to sell the product or the service on the market for more in terms of value in labor hours than they pay the workers in wages. And that difference between the total value of the product it's sold on the market and the total value in wages going to workers, that difference, that surplus value, is where profit comes from. And that's where we go on with Marx's value theory, to say it's not just a question that products can be measured or can be valued in terms of how much labor has gone into them, but also there is an exploitative process here by which workers receive less than the total value of the production that they've made, and the capitalists appropriate the difference in surplus by selling on the market. So that's the fundamental process of the labor theory of value. Think of it this way, viewers, that Marx said, to put it this way: if workers all stop work tomorrow around the world, you can see that nothing will be produced. So it's clearly the case that you can't produce something unless there is labor exerted upon it. So strikes end production. Workers who stop working will end production, both of services and goods. So clearly, the basis of production of goods and services must come from human labor power. And that's the key question that we start from as classical economists. And then we go on to argue about how that labor power, when it's produced, the amount of labor it's produced, how it's distributed between the owners of the means of production and the workers. Under capitalism, it's not distributed so that the workers get the full value of their labor, because it's appropriated, a part of it, by the capitalists, who then have a profit. They only make that profit if they sell on the market. So that's the other thing. They have to sell the goods. So the commodity, the production of things and goods, is no longer just things and goods, services. It's also a commodity. By that we mean it's a thing that's sold on the market. So it becomes a commodity, and that commodity has those two parts of value: its usefulness to everybody and its exchange value to the capitalists who sell it on the market.
All right, great, thanks. In mainstream neoclassical perspectives, I was wondering that value is not even thought of as a useful category. Like, for example, I remember, I don't know if it is an exact quotation, but something resonated in my mind with the sentence: there is no such thing as value, there's only prices. Yeah. And prices are thought of as being reflective of simplistic, let's say, equilibrium between demand and supply. So it sounds a very subjectivistic analysis where everything is related to these supposed laws of demand and supply, which I'm not saying they don't exist, but I'm probably saying that it's not the only thing behind the formation of prices. And how does Marx's labor theory of value differ from this idea?
This is very important, Carlo, because from about the 1830s, 1840s, once the labor theory of value become the main plank of understanding the process of economics amongst the classical economists, there was a sort of counter-revolution by other economists, which we now call mainstream, but they came from supporters of the existing system of capitalism. They didn't like the idea that Marx developed a theory of value which suggested that workers were exploited and that there was surplus values created. So that's where profit came from. So they didn't like the whole idea of the labor theory of value. And they came up with an alternative theory of value, says that things are valuable if they're scarce. So for example, if you are in a desert and you're dying of thirst, that first glass of water that you can get hold of, you will consider extremely valuable. But as you drink more and more glasses of water as you go through the desert, the last glass of water will not be regarded by you as so value. So its use value, or its value in terms of subjectively what you think it's worth, could be reduced. So they argue that value is actually determined by how subjectively you are concerned to get hold of any particular thing or service. But if you think about that, that doesn't really tell you what the value of the product or the service is. It might tell you to you personally, but it doesn't tell you on a market what the price is in any particular way. If you take it to the other end of the extreme, yes, when we look in the shops, when we go and buy things, there's a price, and the price is determined more or less by how much is being supplied of that particular commodity, whether it's a car or a chair, and how much demand there is for it. And that will, so the price will move around according to the supply and demand. But let's think of it this way. A car is approximately, say, 30 or 40,000 euros for a car. Now, a chair is maybe 100 euros, something like that. So, but both cases, it depends on the supply and demand. But why is a car 40,000 euros and why is a chair only 100 euros? It's no good, as the mainstream economists say, well, that's where supply and demand meet for chairs and that's where supply and demand meet for cars, because that doesn't explain why one is at 40,000 and one is at 100 euros. And the answer, of course, lies in how much labour power has been expended, how many hours in terms of producing the machinery, the technology, the raw materials, getting them in place, putting the components together, workers coming, assembling a car, marketing that car to the market. All that requires a lot of labour hours and time. And that's why it's more expensive than a chair. A chair doesn't require all that level of input, both from workers' labour hours and also from machinery and technology. So you can see it depends upon the exertion of labour power, not on whether you have a greater desire for a car over a chair, which makes a difference in price. Clearly, that's not the case. The mainstream economists realised that the idea that it just depends on whether subjectively you feel something's better than something else and you want more of it wasn't a very good theory for explaining what is going on. So their solution to the question was to just say, the famous person who said that was Paul Samuelson, a mainstream economist in the 1960s. He said, well, when he was asked how we get the prices, just accept the prices are what they are. As you say, they're saying that that's where supply and demand meet, so that's where the price is. But it doesn't really explain why the price is high or why the price is low for different commodities and different services. And that's what's so weak and so pathetic about what they call the utility theory of value compared to the labour theory of value.
I guess that one could interpret the labor theory of value as explaining, like, let's say, the price of production as gravitational centers of gravity around which then supply and demand might explain variations in the price of a particular commodity. So, for example, a coffee in a station where there's a lot of demand of coffee might be slightly higher up than in a bar where there's very few customers, but nevertheless is going to be in the ballpark of €1, €2. I mean, probably £10 if you are in a Starbucks in the UK. But you know, it's just that it allows to have an objective conception of value that underlies these massive differences, like the one you highlighted with the car and the chair.
Can I just add, Carlo, the famous paradox presented by the utility theorists is the diamond and water paradox, which says that a diamond is very, very expensive in price because it's so rare and scarce, and water is not abundant, and therefore its price is very low. But of course, if you go on producing diamonds, and diamonds are scarce, but if you could produce a lot of diamonds, and they are produced synthetically now, you find that the price of diamonds falls because there's an increase in the supply of diamonds as a result of mass production of synthetic diamonds. I like the example of a Van Gogh painting. There's only one Van Gogh painting, or of course there's lots more, but there's only one Van Gogh, and his paintings still sell for hundreds of millions now of euros because they're unique. But if you go into any art store, you can get a print of a Van Gogh painting, exactly the same one, a print, being mass produced by capitalist production for, say, 30 euros as opposed to 30 million euros. And the point here is that we really can't base a theory of value on the fact that there's one Van Gogh painting that's unique, and that sets the price because there's only one and everybody wants to have it. It's more the question of what's going on in the general production process in a capitalist economy, which sets the prices. And as you say, of course, what happens is that capitalists compete against each other to try and gain a market share, and therefore they tend to bring about an equalization of the profitability between each capitalist, and that produces a different level of prices, a price of production, Marx called it, which isn't exactly the same as each value expended by each capitalist. There's an equalization process goes on, which produces a price of production in a competitive market. And prices then revolve around that level, that price of production. So there's several stages in Marx's theory of value. First of all, the value of commodity is determined by human labor time, but then capitalists compete with each other so that the value of individual capitalist productions begins to equalize as a result of competition between the capitalists into a general price where average profitability is more or less the same. And that sets the level for the market price, which can go up and down, as you say, depending on whether you're in a very high demand coffee area or in a very low demand coffee area. So, but overall, there's an average from which you can base things and understand why prices are where they are. Prices are where they are for the underlying process of competition going on with capitalism and the amount of labor and time being expended by humanity in producing those products.
Okay, I'm just going to ask another one that is a little bit like the devil's advocate of the neoclassicals. I mean, I don't agree with this, but I'm just asking for the sake of. So it is quite common for everyone that studied economics in the current neoclassical Western educational system to see profits as a fair remuneration of capital as a factor of the productive forces. So there's capital, there's labor, everybody is remunerated according to their so-called marginal productivity. I guess that anyone that studied economics probably was told this story. What would be a Marxian counter-argument to this claim that profits are the fair remuneration of capital?
Yeah, so this is the factors of production theory, which is still the mainstream economic theory, in which they say, okay, workers get wages for the time they put in when they go to work. Landlords get rent for holding property, and they can get rent for it. And capitalists get profit because they own the means of production. And through the kindness of their hearts, they allow that means of production to be used to give workers work and to go and produce on the market. So they are entitled to a share of the total value produced and sold on the market because they own the means of production. And if they didn't get that, then the whole thing would collapse. Well, of course, we could have a society where private ownership of the means of production didn't exist, but that wouldn't stop production. In fact, collective ownership of the means of production would still be possible. So in a way, there's no reason why the capitalists could claim profit as a result of the fact that they own the means of production. That's simply the way in which the social organization has taken place. And this is a theory which tries to justify the existence of capitalists and their means of production, but it's not a theory which actually works, because what they're really saying, as more and more production goes on and becomes more and more capital is more and more placed into it, then there will be a decline in the return that the capitalists will get, and as a result, the fact that the return, the profit for capitalists will begin to move down towards zero as they compete against each other, and the marginal productivity of that whatever is being produced, the marginal productivity, that's the amount of labor value going into it per unit, begins to fall to almost zero. So they say that there's equilibrium reached when there is no profit. And so they don't really have a theory of profit in the end. They deny the existence of profit. And if insofar as there is profit, it's merely what the capitalists are entitled to. The Marxist theory is different. It's saying that profit is a result of the exploitation of labor and the ability of capitalists to appropriate a share of the value that workers produce because they own the means of production and only they employ workers. Workers can't employ themselves in any collective system. And so it's the social organization of capitalism which creates the situation where profit exists. While the mainstream theory is it's merely the fair proportion that capitalists should be entitled to. But that's just assuming that we have capitalism. There's no reason why you should have that particular way of organizing society.
I mean, I guess that one could go even further, claiming that capital itself is nothing but dead labor that it results from past accumulation from exploitation of living labor. So the fact that
exactly capital, I mean, if we talk about capital, that means the ownership of the means of production. So we're talking about factories, the technology, the equipment, the software, all the rest of it that capitalists own and control in order to employ labor to produce things. But where does that come from? That hasn't come out of thin air. That's come through the process of human labor working on those things before, as you say, and they're turning them into machines or into robots or into whatever the machinery and machines of production is that capitalists want. And then, but then once that's done, if the machines are not used by workers, there is no extra value produced. It's just been incorporated into that machine. It is, as you say, dead labor is the phrase used, because it's not living labor. It doesn't produce anything on its own. It's not alive. And contrary to modern latest theory that artificial intelligence is not a human being, it's not producing extra value because it's artificial. And we will see as the process goes on that hasn't really changed anything in the relationship between machinery, which is dead labor, and human beings, which is living labor. And machinery only comes from previous production by living labor. So the labor theory of value is not damaged by the fact that there is capital existing as a result of previous production.
I revisited my Marxian economics recently, and I think that a very good conceptualization of the concepts of constant and variable capital, which are very different in Marxian economics from neoclassical, explains this. Because all, let's say the AI, that would be constant capital. So its value will simply be a transfer of let's say the value that it was bought for into the products that it manages to produce. But it's not variable because it doesn't allow for an extra creation of new value that can only come from living labor. So whereas I guess that in classical economics, constant and variable capital are conceptualized in completely different way. But to me, that was very useful to be reminded of those definitions within Marxian economics.
Well, there was a critic of Marx called Dmitriev who said, well, what about if machines produce the machines that produce the machines and everything is done by machines, that there's no human labor involved? Surely there's things being produced then. You can't deny that things are being produced. Well, there are two answers. So therefore there's value from machines, his argument was. Well, there are two answers to that. First of all, nowhere, anywhere in the world, so far, and probably ever, is it the case that machines will produce machines, and they'll produce raw materials out of the ground, and there'll be no human labor involved. Even now with AI, there's massive amount of human labor being involved in order to train and teach these AI learning machines. So the idea that human labor has disappeared or could disappear is an extremely unlikely, if not ridiculously unrealistic point to make. But even if it did become that the case and things are produced, what we're saying is, at the start of our discussion, is that the machines are now producing use values, things that we need, products and services. And there's no profit involved because no human labor is being exploited. So we have a completely different society. It's not a capitalist society anymore. It's, if you like, just a production society producing use values, things that we need in abundance. It creates a position where human beings could do something else altogether. Unless you're just going to leave a small group of people to own all these machines and the rest of us to starve because we won't be employed. But so the example that machines can create value and therefore the labor theory of value is wrong is not only unrealistic, it's also proposing a completely different society which could be either horrible or tremendous.
Which is probably in the fantasy of the tech bros that are ruling the US.
It is. In fantasy, they're going to replace us all with some super intelligent algorithm.
Wanted to there's a next one that is I don't know, maybe slightly more philosophical, but there's a common perception that Marx's labor theory of value is ultimately a moral or a normative claim. That it's about what workers deserve rather than an objective analysis of capitalism. I guess that the answer to the very first question already probably tackled this point, but I still nevertheless wanted to ask you this, because Marx himself seemed critical of such moral appeals, especially in the texts like the critique of the Gotha program. How would you respond to the view that the labor theory of value is a normative or a moralistic theory, such as like maybe a utopian socialism style?
Well, before Marx developed his own version of value theory from the classical economists, there were loads of people who seized upon the classical political economy's version of value, namely that all value comes from the human labor going to work, and they said this is unfair because clearly workers are not getting what they should get out of the value of production, and therefore we have an unfair system. And socialism will be a fair system because it would ensure that the full fruits of workers' labor went to workers. But this was just a hope, as you like, it was utopian hope that if you created the position although he couldn't explain how they could do that, a system where all the workers' labor, the value created by them, went to the workers, that you required an understanding of what new system that is. And it's not really explained by the utopian socialists. And so some people fell back and saying, and we still have it today, do we not? We have a lot of views that, look, we oppose capitalism, not because it is a system just of exploitation, which it clearly is, but also because it's just unfair, it's rotten, and we need to replace it with a system that's fairer. But Marx and Engels weren't particularly interested in replacing capitalism with a fair system. They wanted to replace it with a system of socialism, which would be fairer, if you want to use that word, and would be better for the population as a whole, but more importantly, would actually work in the interests of the mass of the population. I just have to remind the viewers that as of this year, just 1% of the world's adults own nearly 50% of the world's personal wealth, where we have something like 3.5 billion people in the world now who are on the poverty line or below it. So that's nearly half the world's population of 8 billion, including all the children. That is extremely unfair, but it's no good saying we need a fairer system. We have to understand why that is like that and how that could possibly change once we understand why. So that's the point of Marx's economics in a way, is to say it's not just enough to say things are unfair and wrong. We have to understand why things are where they are and how they could be changed.
Thank you very much. Do you want another? I guess we've got a question from the audience. Alessandro.
Hello, I'm Alessandro Anzani. First of all,
how do you do, Alessandro?
Thank you for your brilliant explanation. I just wonder, you know, automation is in the recent mainstream economic literature a very big issue. You know, Acemoglu, I can spell the name, has had the Nobel Prize for it. And I wonder how automation is relevant in the Marxian theory. For example, the principle of the declining rate of profit. From a Marxian point of view, what can be your point of view about this tendency, the problem of the machines, right? You know.
Well, as everybody we just discussed, if value only comes from human labor power being expended and machines don't produce new value, then if there's more investment takes place in machines and raw materials relative to the amount that we invest in the employment of human labor, then over a period of time, that will mean that the value increase we're getting from labor will gradually fall relative to the amount that we're investing in machinery and technology in general. So what Marx described this tendency in the whole of capitalist economy as he called it a rising organic composition, of capital. So in other words, the investment in machinery and raw materials over time tends to rise more than the investment in labor. Why is that? Because the capitalists are competing with each other. They don't want to spend too much money on wages. If they can find a machine which produces more out of the workers and therefore increases the output they can get and reduces the cost of production, they can take market share off the other capitalists. So they're always competing to find new investments that they can make in machinery and technology to give them an edge over the other capitalists. But everybody tries to get the same machinery. So there's a tendency of a rise in the total amount of machinery being invested compared to labor. And therefore, there's a tendency for the value being produced to fall relative to the total investment taking place. We call that the fall in the profitability, the fall in the rate of profit. And that's a huge tendency in capitalism over the long term. And it's empirically shown to be correct. It doesn't go in a straight line down. It goes up sometimes when there's a good boost in productivity and an exploitation of workers to compensate. But over a long period of time, we can see in all the major economies, there's a tendency for the rates of profit to fall, and actually does fall. Currently, in 2025, if we look at the top 7 world economies, the G7 as it's called, their rate of profit is way, way lower than it was in the 60s. And it's not much better than it was in the 1980s. So that's the trend. Now, coming to automation and AI, if there's an acceleration of spending on machine learning machines, setting up huge data centers, people think AI is just an algorithm, but it needs massive data centers that they're building all over the US and elsewhere, using up huge amounts of electricity and raw materials, by the way, in order to work. So there's going to be there's a huge investment taking place into this machinery, which is supposedly going to save capitalism by boosting the productivity of the economies by shedding loads of people's shedding their jobs, and therefore boosting productivity and making capitalism more profitable. But as you've just pointed out, Alessandro, the result of that is that if there's an increase in machinery relative to the increase in labor, then the value over time will tend to fall relative to the total investment. So what AI automation means is eventually it's going to intensify the fall in the rate of profit over time. This is going to increase the likelihood of crises in capitalism over the next 10, 20 years. We're not going to the position of Dmitriev, where there's no workers involved, but in the process of getting towards that, you're actually going to drive down the profitability of capital in general. So in a way, the AI is the next stage in the further crisis of capitalism, I think, over the next periods, contrary to what each individual capitalist thinks at the moment they're going to get out of AI.
Okay. Thank you very much.
All right.
Okay.
I have got just a couple more questions that are more related to, let's say, an application maybe of these topics to some practical phenomenon that we are witnessing. And we are currently witnessing a shock to the international role and moneyness of the US dollar, which many interpret as a consequence of the United States shifting away from a primarily productive economic base towards a financialized and rentierized economy. Meanwhile, China's rise, rooted in its expanding productive capacity and growing economic power, is enhancing the appeal of its currency on the global stage. Can this shifting dynamic between productive economies and currency dominance be linked theoretically to a vindication of the labor theory of value? I don't know if this is clear.
I think it's quite a good indication of the nature of labor theory of value, and in particular to explain the difference between productive labor and unproductive labor, or those sectors which are productive in investment and those that are unproductive. What do we mean by that in Marx economics? Well, we mean that productive labor and productive investment is where it produces more value than existed before. So workers go to work with new machinery and they produce products more quickly and they produce more value. Unproductive labor is an increasingly large part of what workers do. They are unproductive. In what sense? Well, they actually involve in redistributing the value that's being produced by the productive sectors. So the manufacturing sector, the mining sector, transport, these are productive sectors. But finance, real estate, business services, management of people, these are unproductive. They don't produce any new value themselves. What they do is either redistribute the existing value into sectors like finance and real estate and onwards, or they use to try and control workers and make them work harder in the case of managers. So productive workers and productive sectors are absolutely essential to create new value. But if there's an increase in the unproductive sectors over a period of time, that's going to make it more and more difficult for the economy to produce any sufficient profit and grow, because much of investment is going into areas which won't produce new value. So when money is shifted into finance, there's speculation on the stock market and the bond market, and capitalists and speculators make money by selling and buying bonds and going up and down with the stock market, but it doesn't change the underlying process of increased output going on in the economy, because buying and selling a stock makes no difference to any increase in value. The same with real estate. We speculate in housing and in commercial property, but they don't produce new value that can take an economy forward. So if there's more and more in that area, and of course another huge unproductive area is military spending by the government. That's a massive deduction for the available investment that could be made in the productive sector. And what we've seen in the last 40 years is a big increase in that unproductive sector compared to the productive sector. Why? Because the profitability of the productive sector has been falling over time, and so capitalists have shifted out of the productive sectors. They look for speculation in finance, in real estate, or selling arms, if you like. Look at ways in which they could make a better profit than they can in just investing in new products, boosting the economy's services and goods that we need. I've just pointed out that nearly half the world is starving, or not starving, but on a poverty level. So the increase in unproductive sectors is making it more difficult to keep profitability up as well. And as a result of that, capitalism is slowing down. Capitalist economies are growing at only about, in the advanced economy, like Italy, are growing at 2%. In the case of Italy, even less than 2% a year in increase in production. Well, so that's a very big slowdown from, say, 50 years ago when it was going at 3, 4, 5% a year. And that's what's been happening as there's been a switch to the unproductive sectors. So this is it's a way in which they can make profits over a period of short term, if you like, for a decade or so, but it's increasing the crisis within the capitalist system because the productive sector is becoming smaller relative to the unproductive sector.
Maybe just a final one, but if we conceptualize these westernized, financialized economies and, let's say, productive economies of the, let's say, South, can we also understand the crisis of Western capitalism with the crisis of imperialism? Because, I mean, the system seemed to be functioning up until a redistribution of value was happening from, let's say, the global south to the global north. I guess that neoliberalism could be conceptualized as the attempt to use China as the cheap labor productive part of the economy, Russia as the cheap energy raw materials side. As long as this value transfer was possible, neoliberal period has had a rising productivity. Since this started to not be possible anymore, because the agency of those polities has emerged as non-cooperating with this plan, like China is not accepting to be Japanified, then there's problems, and this might be what the US are facing right now.
Exactly. From the 1980s onwards, we saw a huge shift of the manufacturing sectors of the global north, so-called, that's Europe, North America, Japan, into the so-called global south, into the countries of Latin America, Southeast Asia, China, and elsewhere, because they had cheap labor, and using the latest technology with cheap labor, they could make much bigger profits than they could make at home with high wages, with workers in the G7 economies. That the manufacturing employment was decimated in Britain, in Italy, in Europe, in North America, and it was all shifted into the other cheaper labor areas of the world. But the problem that has developed, that made huge profits for these companies, and they extracted that profit and sent it back to the global north. So we have a huge imperialist transfer of value from the poor countries in the so-called global south to the rich countries of the global north, which continues at some considerable rate. But now the problem has developed in the last 20 years, in particular, in the 21st century, is that in particular, the result of that in general has been successful for imperialism. But in countries like China, which have resisted control by the imperialists in their country, the state still controls basically how to organize the investment in that country and make sure that foreign investment, such as it is, and it's big, is not allowed to control the economy. And therefore, what has happened there, we've seen a massive increase in the technological prowess and economic success of China, which now threatens the global north, but particularly the US hegemony in controlling the technology of the world, and also increasingly its trade. Manufacturing trade is now dominated by China, not anymore by the US, and even in finance, where China has become more and more important. This threatens US dominance, its imperialist control, and its dollar. And this is the frightening thing. This is why we have increasing intense conflict between particularly the US and China, and why Trump has adopted this brutal and vicious policy of tariff increases, which will only hit his own workers, not that he cares about that, in order to try and maintain and sustain America's share of the world markets through these measures. So we're entering a severely conflicting period as a result of this move and the weakening of the position of the US economy, both in manufacturing, but increasingly also in trade, but also in finance, and therefore threatening the position of the dollar too.
All right, I think I probably add another question, but it's probably enough. We can probably wrap it up right here. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed it, and I hope it was useful for also the listeners here in the room. So thank you very much, Michael. I'll contact you for next one.
Thank you, Carla. Thank you, everybody, for listening, and we'll be in touch, no doubt, in the future.
Thank you. Goodbye then.